Okay, I think it's time to start. Dear colleagues and audience, welcome to attend Professor Timothy Williamson's fifth lecture at Wuhan University in the lecture series on logical and philosophy. Okay, first I share the slide. Okay, for the duty of the chair, it's my duty to introduce the Professor Williamson. I'm Yong from Wuhan University. Professor Williamson is the Wickham Professor, Wickham Professor of Logic at Oxford University and the Whitney Griswold Visiting Professor at Yale University. He was previously Professor of Logic and Metaphysics at Edinburgh University and has been Visiting Professor at MIT, Princeton University, University of Michigan, and the Chinese University of Hong Kong. He's a fellow of the British Academy and of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, member of the European Academy of Science and the International Institute of Philosophy, former member of the Norwegian Academy of Science and Letters, international honorary member of the American Academy of Arts and Science, an honorary member of the Royal Irish Academy. His research fields include epistemology, logic, metaphysics, philosophy of language. He has many books which are very influential. Okay. For example, Identity and Discrimination, Vagueness, Knowledge and its Limits, The Philosophy of Philosophy, Model Logic as Metaphysics, Tetralogue, I'm right, you are wrong, Doing Philosophy, From Common Curiosity to Logical Reasoning, Suppose and Tell, The Semantics and Heuristics of Conditionals, Debating a priori. Okay, in this lecture, his talk is related to this book, The Philosophy of Philosophy. In fact, this book has a new edition published in this September. This expanded new edition is one of the most influential and controversial books about the nature of philosophy published in the past several decades. The following passages are from the publisher's website about this new edition of this book, The Philosophy of Philosophy. This book presents an original, unified concept of philosophy as a non-natural science. In this work, distinguished philosopher Timothy Williamson challenges widely held assumptions and clarifies long-standing misconceptions about the methodology and the nature of philosophical inquiry. The author rejects the standard narratives of contemporary philosophy developed from naturalism, the linguistic term, postmodern irony, and other prominent trends of the 20th century. Viewing the method of philosophy as evolving from philosophical pursuits, Williamson provides readers with fresh insight into the self-image of philosophy and offers new ways of understanding what philosophy is and how it actually works. This new edition featured the author's latest thought on a variety of issues, autobiographical reflections, and replies to critics. Okay, here is the characteristic of this new edition from the official publisher's webpage for this new book. It proposes an alternative narrative about the nature of philosophy, argues that the common assumption of philosophical exceptionalism is false, highlights the similarities between philosophy and other science in both methodology and subject matter, explores why contemporary philosophy has failed to articulate an adequate methodology, emphasize increasing the methodological standards of reasoning in philosophy. During this lecture, the audience can freely write down your question anytime during the lecture in the chat book, and the staff at Xuezhuzhi will forward your question to us. At the end of his lecture, Professor Williamson will give his replies. Okay, today is also a pleasure that we have the interlocutor, Professor Yong from Wuhan University. He will give his comment or question after the main lecture, and then Professor Williamson will give his replies. After that, audience can freely ask questions. Okay, now let's first welcome Professor Timothy Williamson, give his 5th lecture at Wuhan University, Reflections on Philosophy. Okay, please.
Right. Well, thank you very much. Now, first of all, I have to share my screen. So let's see. Here we go. Yeah, excellent. So today, as has just been explained, I'm going to be talking about the way my reflections on philosophy have developed. When I was an undergraduate at Oxford in the years 1973 to 76, issues about the nature of philosophy were hard for us to ignore, because the later Wittgenstein, Michael Dummett, Quine, these were all highly influential figures, and their views were all treated as alive options. There were people who would be arguing for them. And of course, those three figures, they had prominent and very sharply contrasting views about the nature of philosophy. So as we were being taught in an environment where there was no agreement about the nature of philosophy, and in which we were influenced by people who made their own views about the nature of philosophy quite prominent, quite a prominent part of their own philosophical activity. So in the case of Wittgenstein and Dummett, they represented different versions of what we can loosely call the linguistic turn in philosophy. But by contrast, Quine regarded philosophy as continuous with natural science and was skeptical of meaning. So I think it's not really correct to think of him as someone who took the linguistic turn. And on a different dimension, they align differently, because Dummett and Quine, they both favored systematic theorizing in philosophy. But by contrast, Wittgenstein strongly opposed that. He thought that philosophical theories were a sign of confusion. So that was, as it were, these were kind of cross-cutting issues, which meant that all three of them represented different options. But one thing that Wittgenstein, Quine, and Dummett actually all shared was a common tendency to condemn much philosophical discourse as unintelligible, because it was not properly grounded in some way in the behavior of the speakers. You might say, well, it wasn't properly connected with the use of the language or something like that, although they would have explained what the proper connection was in different ways. So, for example, Wittgenstein in some way thought that all abstract philosophical theorizing was not properly intelligible. There was something deeply confused about such uses of language, that such ways of talking, which just weren't in some way weren't related to any kind of practice in the way that he thought was needed. And then Quine thought that that talk about meaning, analyticity, synonymy, talk about properties, talk about metaphysical necessity and possibility, talk about intentionality, that all of these things were in some way not properly clear, that they weren't, as it were, part of the language in which we really ought to be doing philosophy. And Dummett, in effect, treated the realist conception of unverifiable truths, things, propositions which are true but which it's impossible to verify. He treated that as something that we couldn't really make any sense of. That he thought that the realists' attempt to give meaning to their realist discourse didn't really work, that there was something wrong with their explanations of meaning. And so one reaction that I had that to all three of them was that in all these cases, I actually found their condemnations of this supposedly unintelligible discourse as unconvincing, and actually based on a simplistic and oversimple view of the relation between language and behavior, which the work of Chomsky had made obsolete. But I mean, Chomsky had given a famous critique of the behaviorist psychologist Skinner in 1959, and he'd in his own work he developed a conception of the mind which was both scientific but also not grounding mental states in the behavior of the agents in the sort of way which, in their different ways, Wittgenstein, Quine, and Dummett all expected. So it seemed to me that all three of those philosophers, Wittgenstein, Quine, and Dummett, they had not fully taken on board the rejection of behaviorist psychology and the way in which psychology was developing in a much more cognitive way that was much more serious about mental states having an existence in their own right, which didn't have to be tied to behavior in the kind of specific ways that they were expecting. And also, as far as I could see, that speculative metaphysics, including modal metaphysics, which I'll be talking about next time, such as I found in philosophers like Leibniz and Berkeley and others, as well as contemporary some philosophers, it made sense just as it was. It was simply wrong to call it unintelligible. That it was perfectly possible to understand what these philosophers were saying, and that when people tried to sort of reinterpret what metaphysicians were doing in line with the linguistic turn, maybe as some kind of proposal about a different language we should speak, it seemed to me that just confused the issues and misrepresented what these people were actually saying, and that as it were, something more like a literal understanding of their metaphysics was actually more faithful to what they intended and what could be understood in their works. So as I said, I'm still talking about the time when I was an undergraduate. I preferred a more straightforward, robust kind of realism about philosophy, which has remained my preference all through my career. So one feature, though, of the, as it were, if you like, metaphilosophical views of Wittgenstein, Quine, and Dummett, their views about the nature of philosophy, is that they were all closely related to their general philosophical views. Their accounts of philosophical language were all, to some extent, applications of their account of language in general. I mean, maybe one might feel, perhaps in some cases, a somewhat biased application, but it's clear with all of them that that their views about the nature of philosophy are not totally separate from their general philosophical views, and so, as it were, the message that conveyed is that metaphilosophy is part of philosophy, not something above or beyond philosophy. Of course, there are ways of studying, of thinking about philosophy which are not really philosophical. For example, if you just think about let's say the sociology of philosophy, that's not such a philosophical way of thinking about it. But the kind of thing that Wittgenstein and Quine and Dummett, the kind of things they were saying about philosophy, these were clearly part of their philosophy. So it's, as it were, it's not that metaphilosophy is something that's kind of separate from philosophy. Another kind of stimulus to thinking about the nature of philosophy, which I already experienced as a student at Oxford in the 1970s, was that I was very aware of the distinction between the prevalent analytic philosophy, I mean prevalent, for example, in the English-speaking world, and the opposed so-called continental philosophy, which was, I mean, continental there, although it was associated with continental Europe, it basically meant non-analytic philosophy, which there was a minority of students and a few teachers at Oxford who were doing some kind of continental philosophy, and in particular, they tended to be influenced by French philosophers such as Derrida and Foucault. So while doing my doctorate from 1976 to 1980, I had some kind of interest in continental philosophy, which I pursued in some reading and by attending meetings of the Radical Philosophy Group, which I think I described in lecture 1. And so the contrasts between these very, very different ways of doing philosophy, they heighten my sense of the importance of methodological issues and also of the dangers of following an inappropriate methodology. And then when I got my my first teaching job in philosophy at Trinity College Dublin, where I was a lecturer from 1980 to 1988, the analytic continental there should be the word divide there. It remained quite salient because maybe for an unexpected reason, because it corresponded to the religious divide, which was central to Irish politics, since Protestantism was imported to Ireland by colonization from England and Scotland, whereas the form of Christianity associated with the Irish who'd been colonized was Roman Catholicism. So traditionally, Protestant departments, which included traditionally Trinity College Dublin, although things were changing, Protestant departments were oriented towards English and Scottish universities, which is understandable given the, as it were, the process of colonization. And so analytic philosophy predominated, and they would, when they had good students, that they would tend to send them to do their doctorates at English and Scottish universities. Whereas traditionally, Roman Catholic departments in Ireland were oriented towards universities in continental Europe, particularly in Roman Catholic countries. And so continental philosophy predominated in those departments. These divisions, they kind of persisted even amongst people who were no longer religious. So it sort of felt that you could be an atheist, but you still had to choose whether you were a Protestant atheist or a Catholic atheist. I mean, that was still how it felt in Ireland in the 1980s. In fact, my senior professor in the department at that time was Michael Sloat, who was by descent was Jewish, but he said that he had the impression that people were kind of classifying him as Protestant because he clearly wasn't Catholic. And so just as a kind of, as it were, an indication of this sort of difference, there were two sort of philosophical organizations, the Irish Philosophical Club and the Irish Philosophical Society. And the Irish Philosophical Club was mainly Protestant and analytic, and the Irish Philosophical Society was mainly Roman Catholic and continental. And actually, I participated in meetings of both. It had already become clear to me that my basic loyalty was to hardline analytic philosophy, but it kind of seemed ridiculous that for somebody like me who was, not Christian in my religious affiliation at all, that it seemed ridiculous that I should be going to one of these and not to the other when the divide had so much to do with this sectarian difference. And so I got a much richer experience of philosophy in Ireland at that time as a result. I should say that since that time, those sectarian lines have become much less marked in Irish philosophy. I mean, they're much less marked in the Republic of Ireland than they used to be, although they haven't totally disappeared. They're still very influential in the politics of Northern Ireland, but I think the departments of philosophy in the Republic of Ireland now, they tend to be just a mixture of analytic and continental, much more than was the case when I was first there. Although the department I belonged to was already a bit of a mixture. It wasn't completely analytic by any means. But at the time when I was working in Ireland in the 1980s, those kind of radical contrasts, they did keep questions about what philosophy is and what it should be vivid for me, because there were these two very, very different traditions being pursued at different universities in the very city where I lived. So up to about roughly 2002, I wrote very little about metaphilosophy. I mean, I was busy writing on other things, the kind of topics that I've been talking about in previous lectures: indiscriminability, vagueness, knowledge, that sort of thing. One sort of, actually, I've changed the date from 2002 to 2003, so you can see it was quite approximate. But one partial exception to writing very little about metaphilosophy was that in developing a knowledge-first approach to epistemology in the 1990s, I criticized attempts to analyze the concept "know" in terms of believe, true, justified, and other sorts of concepts. And I generalized this into a critique of the idea that philosophy aims at conceptual analysis. I suggested that the most important philosophical terms had no such hidden analyses. And in fact, sorry, I'll just go back a minute. That was something that I'd been feeling for quite a long time, because it wasn't simply that the attempt to analyze knowledge in terms of these other concepts seemed to be a degenerating research program, but there were, at the same time, there were also attempts to analyze other philosophically interesting terms. So, for example, causation, meaning, and so on. And those also seem to be following a degenerating path. They were degenerating research programs in a similar way to that of post-Gettier epistemology. And so that in all of these, one could see more and more complicated proposed conceptual analyses, and then more and more complicated counterexamples, and then repairs, and it was just going in the direction of more and more complexity of a not particularly illuminating kind, and it was also just very implausible that our ordinary understanding of these very, very common and fairly central notions like knowing, meaning, causing, and so on, that these should be of such a sort of complicated and unnatural sort. In fact, it didn't seem likely that ordinary people would be able to even understand concepts that really had the kind of structure that these proposals were offering. So, as it were, for a long time, I'd had that kind of skepticism about the conception of philosophy as conceptual analysis, because that just didn't seem to be working out. But then actually, in the way I made the transition to metaphilosophy, that came about in a slightly different way. So I was invited to give a talk to a workshop on intuition and epistemology at the University of Freiburg in Switzerland in 2002. I accepted this invitation in order to force myself to clarify my ideas about intuitions. And that was definitely something which had an overt connection to metaphilosophy, because intuitions were thought to play a central role in philosophical thought experiments, and so part of what I'd be doing in working out what I thought about intuitions was to think about what philosophical thought experiments are and how they work. So my original plan was to apply the account of factive mental states in Knowledge and Its Limits, with intuiting that P treated as analogous to seeing that P. So, if you see that P, it follows that P. And I was thinking, if you intuit that P in the sense I wanted to investigate, it would also follow that P. And so I was thinking of explaining intuiting that P as a form of a way of knowing that P, just as seeing that P, on the view that I developed in Knowledge and Its Limits, is a way of knowing that P. And so my talk at the actual workshop in Freiburg was along those lines, and it was quite schematic, as it were. I had a kind of an overall structure, but I hadn't done very much to fill in the structure in detail. But when I came to write up the talk for publication, I hit a problem. So whenever I tried to give a simple, concrete example of intuiting that P, that's sort of analogous to seeing that P, and I mean that involved having to specify the content of the supposed intuition. I mean, to, as it were, to fill in the P with some particular proposition, just as with seeing that P, we can give an example. You know, it's easy to give examples of seeing that P. I mean, you know, right now I'm seeing that there is a computer screen in front of me, for example. But when I tried to do it with this supposed factive mental state of intuiting, I came up with something complicated whose origin was better explained in other ways. So, you know, I never seem to be able to find a really good example of intuiting that P. And so it was that experience which led me to doubt the theoretical utility of the category of intuition. So it wasn't that I started out with some kind of prejudice against the category of intuition. It was that, as we were trying to give a more detailed account of it, made me appreciate the problems with that category. And actually, I'll just add one more thing about that. So contemporary psychologists do talk about intuitions, and so, you know, that might make you think, well, then so the category of intuitions must be fine if the psychologists are using it successfully. But when you look more carefully at what the psychologists are doing, the category that they use is it's really the category of intuitive judgments, and by intuitive judgments they just mean that judgments that are not based on any kind of conscious reflection. And so, for example, ordinary perceptual judgments, you know, come out as intuitive judgments in the psychologist's sense, because normally when you make a judgment like there's a computer screen in front of me, that's not based on conscious reflection. You can just see that it's the case. So, in effect, seeing that P would be a special case for psychologists of intuiting that P. But that is not at all how philosophers have used the category of the term intuition, where philosophers have thought about it as something special that was disjoint from perception and from sense perception, and, you know, much more special than that. So the psychologist's use of the category doesn't really help the use that philosophers try to make of it. So when I was trying to give these examples of intuition, that you know, like, for example, the intuition that the subject in a Gettier case lacks knowledge, the content of the intuitions about hypothetical cases they turned out to be conditionals about what would be if those cases obtained. So, for example, if you were in one of the cases that Gettier described, if you were the agent in that case, then you would not know that such and such, you would not know that Jones was in Barcelona or whatever the example was. So these were conditionals of a certain kind. And so another example would be if we were talking about the analysis of causation, we would have maybe some complex setup, and then we would ask if such and such happened, if that setup was realized, would C have caused E, whatever C and E might be in the example. And those are the kind of thought experiments that we used to test analyses of causation. So, it's seemed to me on the reflection that when we're judging a conditional like that, a counterfactual conditional, that's just the sort of imaginative offline analog of the online process of judging whether C did cause E when one has perceived such and such happened. So this, as it were, the online case would be where you actually, watch, observe such and such happening, and then you ask yourself some question: did C cause E? And then what's going on when we do a thought experiment is that we're going through a very similar process, except that we're doing it through imagination rather than through sense perception. And so it doesn't seem like we're actually dealing with a really independent category, but something that needs to be understood just as as the offline analog of a quite familiar type of online process, which has to do with judgments mediated by sense perception. So, and this obviously had some implications also for what one thought about thought experiments, because there's nothing specially philosophical about making causal judgments on the basis of perception, and so the idea that philosophical thought experiments involve some kind of special philosophical intuition, it just didn't fit what's actually going on with these examples, because there's nothing especially philosophical, as I say, about making causal judgments on the basis of perception. But then, excuse me. Then if we're just doing the offline analog of that, which is in making a causal judgment about some imagined setup, that's not specifically philosophical either, because those kind of offline judgments are ones that we often make when we're considering counterfactual conditionals. So what seemed to me, when I thought much more carefully about philosophical thought experiments, is that what's going on in them is not anything very specially philosophical. It's not some peculiar philosophical method in any deep sense, and that became that sort of reflection became central to my later response to experimental philosophers who criticized reliance on philosophical intuitions as a feature of philosophical method, because it seemed to me that this category of philosophical intuitions was ill-defined and just didn't correspond to the psychological reality. So the experimental philosophers had actually failed to identify a distinctively philosophical method. So they, in a way, their critique didn't make much sense. I mean, I don't mean it was strictly meaningless, but it wasn't. They hadn't actually managed to put their finger on, something that philosophers were doing that other people were not doing. And of course, that reinforced my anti-exceptionalism about philosophy. I mean, my view that philosophy is not exceptional epistemologically, metaphysically, or semantically when it's compared to the range of other sciences, contrary to what many philosophers like to think. And just to emphasize, when I talk about sciences, I'm not just talking about the natural sciences. I'm including other sciences. I regard mathematics, for example, is obviously a science, but it's not a natural science. And I also think of history, when it's done in a scholarly way, as a kind of science. But again, not really a natural science. And so it seemed to me that the way people had been thinking about thought experiments made philosophy seem much more exceptional epistemologically than it really is. That all we're doing is we're forming, we're making counterfactual conditional judgments, which is not distinctively philosophical, and we're making them about some scenarios that just happen to be interesting because they provide tests of certain philosophical hypotheses. So that was how I got into the debates about thought experiments and philosophical intuitions and so on. And around the time when I was starting to think about those matters, I was also invited by Brian Leiter to contribute to a volume on the future for philosophy. And so I took the opportunity to write up views I'd long held about the linguistic term, because as I've kind of hinted, even when I was an undergraduate, I was pretty skeptical that the linguistic term really represented, a piece of key progress in philosophy. So in the piece that I wrote for that volume, I explained why the linguistic turn was a much less decisive moment in contemporary philosophy than many philosophers still assumed, and why it actually didn't fit what was happening in metaphysics, and it didn't even fit what was happening in philosophical logic. So, I mean, metaphysics is kind of, an obvious challenge to the linguistic term, but philosophical logic is much more closely related to linguistic matters, and so it might look like more promising ground for the linguistic term. But one thing I emphasize, for example, even in relation to some questions about vagueness, that in some way some of the key questions, although it's very tempting to think of them as questions about language, they're not really about language at all. They're actually questions about the non-linguistic world. Of course, it's the world that we describe in language, but that doesn't mean that the world that we're talking about is it's linguistic in any distinctive sense. And so, I was also in that work, I was also wanted to explain why the attempt to understand philosophy as an inquiry into conceptual connections doesn't work. So conceptual connections, that might seem less dependent on language than talking about semantic conceptions, for example, or linguistic connections. But although in fact, when people talked about conceptual connections, they usually were talking about connection. I mean, the concepts that they were thinking of, or concepts that they associated with the meanings of words. So it wasn't as big a change as you might think. But I think even just focusing on conceptual connections seemed to me not really a promising way for philosophy to go. I mean, it may be that in philosophy we have knowledge of necessary connections, but I think that they're not conceptual in any distinctive sense, because someone can reject them. I mean, somebody can deny that these connections hold, on what may be mistaken theoretical grounds, but are still theoretical grounds. And even if someone does that, they may still count as understanding the relevant words. So in that sense, these are not conceptual truths or analytic truths, because they're not truths which you get as well just by understanding the relevant words or possessing the relevant concepts. There's also a theoretical judgment that's involved in them, which we're not forced to make just because we understand these words. We can resist it. I mean, even if it's in fact a correct connection, a necessary connection, that doesn't mean that assenting to it is a precondition of understanding the words. And so this also reinforced my anti-exceptionalism about philosophy, because contrary to what many philosophers still claimed, it's not a conceptual inquiry in any sense that would distinguish it from other sciences. I mean, there was still a tendency, I mean, among some people, you can still find it, to think that philosophy is different from, as well, what goes on in the other sciences, because in the other sciences, people are just applying concepts, whereas in philosophy, we're thinking about the concepts themselves and maybe improving them or clarifying them or criticizing them, whatever it is. And I don't think that philosophy is a conceptual enterprise in any distinctive way. I mean, of course, in all sciences, there is an aspect of developing appropriate terminology, finding where to draw the fruitful distinctions and so on. But I don't think that makes philosophy deeply different from any other science. That this is just something that one aspect of scientific activity in general. So from about 2003, I was working intensively on metaphilosophical topics. I mean, I was also working on some issues in logic as well, but a lot of my time was being spent on metaphilosophy in that period from 2003 onwards. And then I was invited to give the 2005 Blackwell-Brown lectures, a series of 3 lectures at Brown University in the United States, which involved publishing them with Blackwell. So it was a series of, I think, 3 lectures. So I decided to give the lectures on metaphilosophy, and very much expanded those lectures, turned into my book, The Philosophy of Philosophy, which, I mean, the first edition of which was published in 2007. And I gave it that title because I wanted to emphasize that we're studying philosophy from within philosophy, that the epistemology of philosophy is an application of general epistemology. The metaphysics of philosophy is an application of general metaphysics, and the semantics of philosophy is an application of general semantics. So, and of course, that's completely in line with my anti-exceptionalist approach to philosophy. But I think it's also, in a way, relatively hard to resist. I mean, that if you have a general approach to epistemology, then surely that's got to apply to questions of knowledge and justification in philosophy as well. And if you've got a general metaphysical view, then whatever metaphysics you think is involved in philosophy, whatever metaphysical matters philosophy is talking about, that your general metaphysics has to apply to those. And similarly, if you've got a general semantic theory, then that will apply to the semantics of philosophical language, just as it applies to the language of any other science. So the book, The Philosophy of Philosophy, it defends what was known as Armchair Philosophy. I mean, which was it's usually a phrase intended by people who somewhat disapprove of it. But the book was a qualified defense of that method, of those methods of the traditional ones of doing philosophy, mainly by thinking, maybe talking with other philosophers and writing and so on, not by getting up out of your armchair and doing experiments, making observations and measurements with special instruments and that kind of thing. So, thinking, talking, and writing, those are all things you can do in an armchair. And after all, people don't complain about armchair mathematics. Mathematics is still something that you can mainly do in an armchair, but people don't complain about that. So it's not so obvious why the fact that philosophy is done in armchairs would be a ground for complaint. And what I wanted to do in the book was to show how the traditional methods of philosophy are not unscientific. They're simply those that are best adapted to the questions being asked. I mean, that's why there's so much methodological diversity between sciences, between natural sciences and mathematics and history and so on. It's because, it seems to me, roughly speaking, each science is using the methods that are best adapted to the kinds of questions that it's asking. I mean, of course, in the natural sciences, experimentation is important, but it's not particularly useful in mathematics, and it's not particularly useful in history. And so, we have to allow for some diversity of methodology between sciences. But once you allow for that, then philosophy doesn't stand out as completely exceptional anymore. It's just within the normal range of variation methodologically that you find in the sciences. And so, if you think about the methods of experimental philosophy, I mean, the doing surveys of large numbers of people and asking them what they think about what verdict they have in various thought experiments and that kind of thing. I mean, those methods, they're well adapted for some psychological and sociological questions, but not for most philosophical questions. So, for example, the methods of experimental philosophy, they're good for answering the question, do most people think that torture is wrong? But they're not good for answering the question, is torture wrong? I mean, if we would doing philosophy by opinion polls is not much better than doing physics by opinion polls. So just as a kind of an aside, since the book, The Philosophy of Philosophy, since it defends armchair philosophy, when I was thinking about what to have on the cover of the book, I thought of having a picture on the front of someone in an armchair. And And I mean, I easily found, when I searched online, I easily found a picture of an old man with a long white beard sitting in an armchair. And that would be the sort of conventional thing to put on the cover. But that would have reinforced the impression that armchair philosophy is kind of old-fashioned, out of date, that it's been left behind by the modern world. And so I preferred a painting by Pablo Picasso, actually called Portrait of Olga in an Armchair, of a young woman, his wife, in an armchair. It's not even very obviously an armchair, but the title of the picture makes clear that it was an armchair. As it were, that cover picture, it coded the message that the stereotype of armchair philosophy is wrong. It was, I mean, of course, not everybody realized what the point of the cover was, but the coded message was armchair philosophy is not what you think it is. And so, I mean, that's the cover if you haven't seen it. So in a kind of broad way, the philosophy of philosophy applied the approach of knowledge and its limits to the epistemology of philosophy, not in the way that I'd originally intended, which was giving an account of intuiting as a factive mental state, but in a broader sense, what I was saying about the epistemology of philosophy in the book was done within the framework of the knowledge first approach that I developed in Knowledge and Its Limits. And in particular, it applied the equation of one's total evidence with one's total knowledge. And it applied that equation to evidence in philosophy. And so, of course, the implication is that anything that we know is eligible to count as evidence in philosophy. If it's relevant for us to use it, we can use it, but, because that's all that evidence is. So, this, as opposed to some, for example, conception of evidence as sense experience, where it would certainly, if you thought of evidence that way, it certainly wouldn't be obvious what the relevance of such evidence was to most philosophical disputes. But on my view, just anything that you know can be used as evidence in philosophy. Of course, there's only a point in using it if it's actually relevant to the philosophical question. But if it is relevant and you know it, then you can use it. Which seems to me actually rather sort of commonsensical view. And so, for example, there's no restriction to using only things which are known a priori or unknown in some conceptual way, or and no restriction to necessary truths. That just anything that you know can be used. And one particular application of this was in opposing what was, and to some extent still is, a popular idea among analytic philosophy, that reflective equilibrium is the method of philosophy, because it is just reflective equilibrium is really a form of coherentism and so of internalism. So the idea of reflective equilibrium is that you achieve some kind of equilibrium between your particular judgments about individual cases and your theoretical hypotheses, and as a way you bring them into some kind of consistency with each other, and or more generally that you bring all your beliefs into some kind of coherent system. And an example of somebody proposing such a methodology is David Lewis in the preface to his first volume of philosophical papers, and it has some initial credibility because it seems to correspond to quite a lot of what we do in philosophy. So it's not a kind of crazy idea, but there's something fundamentally wrong with it from a knowledge first perspective. And maybe one can bring out what's wrong by saying that it would be hopeless to describe the method of physics as reflective of equilibrium, because that would ignore the sources of the elements we're trying to bring into equilibrium, e.g. our evidence. So if we were talking about physics, if we just think of it as reflective equilibrium, that doesn't give any special weight to the fact that a whole lot of these judgments, which are supposed to be brought into equilibrium, come as well, are reports of observation of the results of experiments, of measurements that we've made, and so on. And so, I mean, that's the internalist aspect of the conception of the methodology as reflective at equilibrium, that it doesn't really give any weight to the source of the elements that we're trying to bring into this equilibrium. And I think that the same problem of as it were, over-restricting the aspects of that we're dealing with to in this internalist way, the same fundamentally the same problem is there if you try to apply this to philosophical method, without, for example, asking whether any of these judgments constitute knowledge or not, because if you're not concerned with their source, and so I think that in the case of philosophy, it's kind of less obvious that something is going wrong when you describe the method as reflective equilibrium. I mean, if something very obviously was going wrong, I think David Lewis would have noticed it. But I think there is something non-obviously going wrong, which has to do with we're not really taking into account the sources of the judgment, and so it's a too narrow description of what the methodology is. So, as I say, the criticism of trying to understand the method of physics in this internalist way as reflective equilibrium, it applies to philosophy, but just in a subtler way. Another way in which, in the philosophy of philosophy, I applied a knowledge-first approach was in characterizing a constraint on the interpretation of philosophical discourse. Knowledge maximization. That's I won't go into the details of that, but that's fundamentally a kind of principle of charity. But where is the sort of principle of charity that an interpretation that's associated with, for example, Donald Davidson, is truth maximization, i.e., interpreting what people are saying in a way that maximizes the truth. The idea of knowledge maximization is that just maximizing truth is not really what an appropriate methodology for interpretation, because there's no real gain in maximizing, as it were, accidental truth. But what we should be doing is maximizing the extent to which we interpret the discourse as an expression of knowledge. So that, as it were, this is putting knowledge above true belief and true statement in the methodology of interpretation. And in the philosophy of philosophy, I argue that you've got to be aware of those kind of constraints on interpretation when, for example, you're considering skeptical hypotheses and so on, because often the discussion of skepticism doesn't really take into account the kind of constraints on the interpretation of the judgments that, for example, Brains and Vats are making. Now I want to say a bit about what happened after the publication of the first edition of the Philosophy of Philosophy. one effect of it was that it drew me into debates with various groups of philosophers, such as experimental philosophers, naturalists, theorists of concepts, and followers of Wittgenstein. So in the case of experimental philosophers, I'd said some things which were kind of aimed at experimental philosophy in the philosophy of philosophy, but I hadn't really given an extended treatment to it. And so I was forced in later work to consider in a much more detailed way what experimental philosophers were doing, and to develop my critique of it, in a way that was engaged closely with what experimental philosophers were saying about their program, particularly the negative program of criticizing so-called reliance on philosophical intuitions. And in the case of the naturalists, a funny experience I had with the philosophy of philosophy that was that some people interpreted me as a naturalist, and some people interpreted me as an anti-naturalist. I think on the whole, the people who interpreted me as a naturalist had read the book more carefully than the people who interpreted me as an anti-naturalist. And I mean, I think some of the people who interpreted me as an anti-naturalist didn't actually read the book, but I wanted to differentiate myself to some extent from naturalism, because I think the trouble is that the term naturalism can mean a lot of different things, and and sometimes if it just means that we should do philosophy in a scientific spirit, in a very broad sense of science, then I probably do count as a naturalist. And I also certainly think that if we put forward philosophical theories that are inconsistent with well-tested theories in natural science, that's not a good thing to be doing. But the trouble is that when people talk about naturalism, they use these kind of, as it were, harmless sounding slogans as a way of sneaking in a much more radical kind of naturalism, which involves insisting that philosophy should follow specifically the methods of natural science, which I think would be a disaster, because those methods are not well adapted to philosophical questions on the whole. And I mean, they're adapted to the questions that they're applied to, but philosophical questions are a bit different. I mean, they're partly just through being more theoretical, and because it's often not clear how experiments would be relevant. And so I had to do some writing to distinguish myself, both from the kind of from the crude anti-naturalism and from the crude naturalism, both of which were being attributed to me. And then, as I expected, I had to engage, with theorists of concepts who wanted to defend some kind of version of analyticity and conceptual connections, and so who were constantly making new proposals about exactly what the relation is between conceptual connections and ordinary understanding of concepts, and so on. And I also had quite a number of engagements with followers of Wittgenstein, who although Wittgenstein has, his influence in the English-speaking world has greatly declined since I was a student in the 1970s. There are still quite a few followers of Wittgenstein, and of course editors, who wanted some kind of, as it were, violent clash of views. In a book symposium or something, they would often get Wittgensteinian philosophers to comment on the book. And I mean, I think on the whole, I find those engagements the least productive of those that I've had with various opponents in metaphilosophy. But and these debates, they helped me to expand and develop my account of the nature of philosophy and of philosophical method. So the first edition of the book was written around a very closely linked group of themes: the linguistic turn, analyticity, thought experiments, knowledge of necessity, skepticism about philosophy. And in subsequent discussion, I realized how much more I wanted to say about other aspects of philosophy. And so, for example, I ever since I was since I was a student at Oxford, I'd taken abduction, or inference to the best explanation, to be central to theory construction and comparison in philosophy, even including in philosophical logic, just as it is in natural science. And this method, of course, it emphasizes theoretical virtues like simplicity, elegance, power to explain and unify, informativeness, as well as consistency with evidence. And of course, I think many philosophers already used such an abductive methodology. But there were other tendencies, and still are other tendencies in philosophy, which went in the opposite direction. For example, forcing philosophical arguments into a deductive form, from supposedly self-evident premises, or making philosophical accounts as neutral as possible. And neutral there basically meant uninformative. They would give you as little as possible. And and I think both of those can be damaging in philosophical method. I mean, of course, sometimes philosophical arguments naturally take a deductive form, and there's nothing wrong with that. Although we probably shouldn't be thinking of the premises as self-evident. In fact, the deductive form may be more like when we deduce predictions from a philosophical theory that from a scientific theory than where we as we're trying to reach conclusions, starting from completely uncontroversial premises. And I think making philosophical accounts neutral, and this also applies sometimes to theorizing in logic. I think it's both based on an illusion about how about whether neutrality is even possible. But I think it's also just evading the central challenge, which is to say something informative about the questions that we're interested in. And so I think that idea that we should be putting forward theories which in all sorts of respects are neutral, I think is just a misconception of what philosophy and indeed logic are about. Anecdotally, when Michael Dummett supervised me for my doctorate, we disagreed about the legitimacy of using abduction in philosophy. I mean, I think he identified it as something on which we disagreed, because in the chapter that I'd given him for the supervision, he saw that I was using a kind of abductive method, or inference to the best explanation, and he identified that as something where I thought it was legitimate and he thought it was illegitimate, which actually really surprised me. I mean, because I couldn't see what kind of case he expected to make for his own philosophical theories if he did not use abduction, because his own philosophical theories were for example, his theories of meaning, they were quite systematic and general, and there was no chance of deducing them from self-evident premises. So if he was going to try to justify them at all. It would have to be by, as far as I could see, by something like the inference to the best explanation, that they explained, as it were, the data about meaning more successfully than any other theory of meaning. But somehow he thought he could get by without using inference to the best explanation. I still don't understand how he thought he could do that. So in the first edition of the Philosophy of Philosophy, I said very little about abduction, but it was central to my view of philosophical method. And as soon as I got involved in debates, in live debates about philosophical method, I find I was often appealing to the abductive methodology. So I've written much more about it subsequently, because obviously that's an aspect of my conception of philosophy that needs to be made explicit. And another method of theorizing that I have emphasized much more subsequently is that of model building. I mean, again, it's briefly mentioned in the Philosophy of Philosophy, but it's not really made a topic in its own right. And so by model building, I mean the use of simple mathematical structures to capture some aspects of messy, complicated phenomena, which, of course, philosophy is also concerned with, because much of philosophy is concerned with human phenomena, and all human phenomena are messy and complicated. I mean, philosophy of language is mainly concerned with human language, not philosophy of mind is mainly concerned with human minds. I mean, these are not exclusive, but the main concern is human minds. Moral philosophy and political philosophy, they're mainly concerned with human action and human societies. Philosophy of art is mainly concerned with philosophy of human art, and so in all these cases, model building is an option which we shouldn't neglect if it can help. And so this model building methodology is widespread in the natural and social sciences. And in my own case, I became increasingly interested in it through research collaboration with the Korean theoretical economist Hyun Song Shin, when we were colleagues at Oxford in the early 1990s. We co-authored 2 articles on epistemic logic, but aspects of epistemic logic that were of interest to very theoretical economists. And the model building methodology is completely standard in theoretical economics. So, although some philosophers do use the model building methodology, I think it's underused and underappreciated in philosophy. I think it has more possibilities in philosophy. I mean, for example, I've been interested in applying it more systematically in formal epistemology, and I think it's the way it works is also underappreciated in philosophy. So many philosophers don't really understand the legitimacy of making simplifying assumptions, as we do when we're building all kinds of models. And they don't realize that what we're doing in philosophy is really just the same kind of thing as, for example, physicists might be doing when they treat planets as point masses or something like that. And that those kind of simplifications, they have a legitimate use in philosophy as well as in the natural and social sciences. And so much scientific progress, it seems to me, takes the form of building better models rather than discovering new universally true generalizations. I think, as far as I can understand, I think this is, for example, applies to a lot of what goes on in biology, that biologists are not really looking for exceptionless laws of biology. They're looking for better models of biological phenomena. And so progress in those areas takes the form of building better models, and one can say something about what makes these models better. And I think that progress in philosophy can take that form. So philosophers who don't understand the model building methodology, they fail to recognize such progress, and so they underestimate how much progress philosophy is making. So I think one unfortunate case of this is that philosophers, we often have the feeling that, oh, we're doing so much worse than natural scientists. But I think we're actually in danger of, well, I think we do often exaggerate the difference, because what we're looking for is, what are the universal laws that philosophy has discovered recently? And of course, it's difficult to find good examples of that. But I think what people don't realize often is that it's also difficult to find examples of universal laws in many areas of science which have recently been discovered. And when we understand how the progress that has been made in much of natural science is of this model building kind, I think we can realize that actually we're making that kind of progress in philosophy too in many areas. So that I think in epistemology and in philosophy of language, we may be making a kind of model building progress, which is not finding universal generalizations, but is making the same kind of progress as we get in much of the natural sciences. And even in areas like moral and political philosophy, which might seem as well very unsuitable for model building, actually the model building methods are often quite appropriate. And when you think about, for example, about things like decision theory and about the way in which some game theory, for example, focusing on something like prisoner's dilemma, can cast light on moral and political dilemmas. I think that those are the beginnings of a model building methodology in moral and political philosophy, and I think there's plenty of room for that in the future. So I think as there were greater awareness and greater use of model building, and also changing our self-image of philosophy, so that we understand that is often a relevant kind of progress that we can be making in philosophy, can, as it were, help us to realize that we're actually not doing anything like as badly as we thought in philosophy, that we're making quite significant progress, a lot of progress, but just not progress that fits the stereotype that we taken over from science without realizing it doesn't even apply to much of natural science. So recently, just in fact, in September, a new edition of the Philosophy of Philosophy was published, which is twice as long as the first edition, and it adds all the work that I've done on metaphilosophy since the first edition, and I think gives a much more kind of rounded account of philosophy. That, although I'm sure that there are still still plenty of gaps, and to show the continuity, I use the same picture, the Picasso of Olga in an armchair, but the color is different. So that's it. Thank you for listening.
Okay, let's first thank the speaker for this very comprehensive insightful and wonderful lecture. Has many new ideas and challenging many traditional views about nature and methodology of philosophy. Okay, we have a lot of time for the question and answer session. And it's our pleasure to introduce the interlocutor of this lecture, Professor Yong from Wuhan University. He received his PhD from St. Louis University, USA. Now he's Professor of Philosophy at Wuhan University and Associate Dean of School of Philosophy at Wuhan University. He works primarily in ethics and political philosophy and focuses on Confucian ethics and comparative political philosophy. He served as a book review editor for Dao, a journal of comparative philosophy, co-editor for the book series Literature Studies in Contemporary Chinese Philosophy. Okay, now it's your time, Li Yong, please.
Great, thanks, Professor Williams, for this very interesting and accessible lecture. So I understand some of the materials were taken from the preface for the revised edition of your philosophy book, but still very interesting. So I did made a PPT of the 4 questions I'm going to ask. So I'm going to use that. Okay, so can you see the PPT?
Yes.
Okay, great. So, I mean, as Professor Chen Yong was introducing my background, mostly more on the political philosophy from a comparative approach. So some of, some of the questions I'm going to ask are in general more broad and more will be more interesting from the Chinese philosophers' perspective, not particularly constrained by the analytical tradition. So my first question is about the connection between philosophy and culture. So since early 2000s, there has been intensive debate among philosophers in China, especially scholars who are doing Chinese philosophy. So they are debating whether there is Chinese philosophy. And this question revived from the previous debate in early 20th century, before 1949. A lot of scholars were also debating this particular question, but it revived in the early 21st century. It's still going on. I can still see people publishing articles on this, leading scholars on this. So there are 3 views about this question. The first one is no, there is no Chinese philosophy. So philosophy is a unique discipline in the West. A lot of people who are doing Western philosophy or doing analytic philosophy in China, they have this view. They think we should call scholars who are doing Chinese philosophy historians. They are not philosophers. So a lot of people who are listening or viewing this lecture probably have this view. Then this is the second view. Chinese philosophy is a unique presentation of the kind of philosophy that originated in ancient Greece and developed through history in the West. But Chinese philosophy is less philosophical. For the people who have this view, they think Western philosophy or analytic philosophy is more philosophical than Chinese philosophy. So there is this gradation or difference between Chinese philosophy and analytic philosophy. So people who study both analytic philosophy and Chinese philosophy, some of those scholars hold this view. Then this is a more popular view among scholars who are doing Chinese philosophy in China. So they say, yes, Chinese philosophy is philosophy, and there is a broader concept of philosophy that's present in different cultures. Analytic philosophy, continental philosophy, Greek philosophy, they're all philosophy. So there is a more broad concept of philosophy. So my first question is, what do you think about this? You did, I mean, from time to time, you did specify you are an analytical philosopher, but you did talk about the progress of philosophy, and also you're talking about modeling is good for overall philosophy, not just analytic philosophy, but more on political philosophy. So this is the first question, whether culture has some relevance to more pluralistic understanding of philosophy, or which of the three views you agree. So that's the first question. So the second question is about the connection between philosophy and the values. So it seems there are two different views among people who do analytic philosophy. So the first group thinks if analytic philosophy is similar to natural science, you did talk about science is a broad concept. It's not just natural science, right? Philosophy should learn from mathematics, right, and other sciences. And the moral and political values are outside the domain of natural science. Analytic philosophy should not investigate moral and political values. I recognize this view echoes some of the early logic positivists. You did talk a bit, I think, in your book, or the first lecture, I forgot, A.J. Ayer, who was teaching in Oxford. So probably he and other people of the logic positivists would have this view, right? But I think it's also popular among some analytic philosophers. The second view is that analytic philosophy can be productive with both practical and non-practical domains. I mean, at the end of your talk today, you did talk a bit about moral and political philosophy. How could they be benefited from modeling, right? So I assume you think analytic philosophy should investigate moral and political values. But it seems there are some tensions here. I mean, especially in contemporary pluralistic societies, a lot of people see the diversity of moral and political values set apart the concepts traditionally investigated by analytic philosophy and the discussion about moral and political philosophy. So the idea of truth, the idea of reality, the idea of universality seem to be kind of fading away from the discussion in moral and the political domains. So I want you to talk a bit about this particular connection between philosophy and the values. Okay. So the third question is about naturalism. I noticed in your book you did discuss this. I did not finish the book, so I just want to hear more about this from you. So I can think of two relevant questions here. One is, should a methodological naturalism be, I was going to ask, should methodological naturalism be exclusively applied in analytic philosophy? So in other words, we should only apply methodological naturalism rather than any kind of non-naturalism. The reason I'm asking this question is it seems there are scholars who are doing called analytical theology today. I mean, analytical philosophy, religion. Some of them argue kind of non-naturalistic approach to study some issues in philosophy, right? Philosophy, religion. So I want to hear your view about this. The second one is, so should the metaphysical naturalism be assumed in analytic philosophy? I assume here the concept analytic philosophy is a normative concept, right? The right kind of analytic philosophy, right? The analytic philosophy that would progress. Again, this is related to some of scholars' discussion about non-naturalism in philosophy, religion in the analytic tradition. Like some earlier American analytic philosophers have been blending the right people also do epistemology. So that's third question. Here's the last question. So you did talk a bit about this at the end of your lecture, right? The idea of progress. So you do believe in progress in philosophy or in analytic philosophy. If we jump out of the domain of analytic philosophy, we talk about the progress in general in philosophy, right? In a broad concept of philosophy. I can think of kind of three different understandings from understanding of progress from a broader concept of philosophy, not particularly in analytic philosophy. So I can think consensus, right? So the reason we think analytic philosophy or philosophy in general is progressing because we have more consensus. So with more interactions among philosophers from the globe, from UK, Europe, North America, Asia, right, South America, we are in the directions of consensus on many philosophical issues. This understanding definitely can be applied in analytic philosophy, but also can be applied in non-analytic philosophy, if indeed there is progress in non-analytic philosophy. The second understanding of this idea of progress for a common understanding of philosophy is kind of convergence, right? We are converging on the methodology and the issues of philosophy. Again, not particularly constrained to analytic philosophy due to social and technological developments, right? So, for example, internet, right, and other technologies, AI, right? So people are converging on the methodology. They realize certain methodologies will produce more, I don't know, knowledge or right. So people recognize there is a universal method and relatively universal issues of philosophy that would be significant or that are significant for different cultures, different countries. So last one is kind of understand progress as an accumulation. I mean, I might be wrong. I think you might be more sympathetic to this last understanding, right? So similar to physics, chemistry, some philosophers are discovering more truth in domain. For example, analytic philosophers are discovering more truth in domain. There are some, I think there are some you call evidence or support this view for analytic philosophy. I mean, if you look at journals like Philosophy Review, Mind News, it seems there are progress, there are accumulation of knowledge of the discussion through the century on particular issues. So I am wondering which view or some other understanding of progress that you endorse when you talk about progress. So those are the four of the questions I had. And thank you for this very interesting talk.
Right. Well, thank you for your very interesting questions, and I'll try to answer all of them. So first of all, on philosophy and culture, yes, I absolutely think that there's such a thing as Chinese philosophy, and that philosophy is something that's present in many different cultures, and actually, I have an ex student, Harvey Lederman, who's now a professor at Princeton, who's part of whose research is on the history of Chinese philosophy, and when he talks to me about it, it's clear that the philosophers that he's interested in are that they're concerned with general issues about, for example, the relation between knowledge and action and so on, which I think are manifestly philosophical issues. So I don't at all accept the kind of narrow conception of philosophy that maybe or at least the logical positivists had, or anything like that. So I have no difficulty with recognizing that there is such a thing as Chinese philosophy. Of course, I mean there's a difference between doing the history of Chinese philosophy and, as it were, and doing, as it were, first order philosophy in the Chinese tradition, but that distinction between, as it were, the first order philosophy and the history of philosophy is something that applies to any philosophical tradition. So I mean, that's on question one. That's a very clear yes. And on question two, which was about the philosophy and values. Again, I think I think philosophy should be concerned with practical and moral questions, as well as purely theoretical questions, and I think that the kind of ethos that science should be value free, that you get in the natural and social sciences to some extent. I think that's I mean, it may be that that's a reasonable constraint on some of their specific activities, but I heard some very interesting observations from this about the role of moral philosophy in the interaction between philosophy and the social sciences, from Elizabeth Anderson, who does quite a lot of moral and political philosophy at Michigan, and her view was that one of the great contributions that philosophy can make to these interactions is that philosophers are willing to talk in an explicit and systematic way about questions of value and right and wrong and so on, and that's actually in a way quite liberating. She's particularly talking about social scientists, because of course for many social scientists the studies that they're doing raise obvious questions about value and policy and so on, which in fact they have very strong views about, but which they're kind of inhibited from being explicit about because of the pressure to, as it were, to work in this kind of value-free way. Whereas philosophers are happy to be open and explicit about these kind of value-laden issues. And I think it's certainly, if for example, moral or political assumptions or are influencing the way that social scientists do their research, then it's probably better that they should be explicit about that rather than kind of hiding it. And I mean, you were talking about the idea that the conceptions like truth and universality, as applied to moral issues, might be on the way out. I mean, I myself am inclined towards some quite strong form of moral realism. So I think that there are facts about what's right and what's wrong in a genuinely moral sense, and in fact most people know quite a lot about what's right and wrong, and they can recognize that torture is wrong and so on, and so actually, although I haven't myself worked very much on this, I do. If anybody's interested, if they go to my webpage, they can find there's an article there called "Moral Anti-Exceptionalism," which is a kind of defense of moral realism against some critics, and I don't think that the kind of objections that are made to moral realism are at all convincing. And just as a comment, at the moment at Oxford, there's a very active sort of school of people doing applied ethics, and who I think all take the view that moral questions have right and wrong answers. So I'm also think that it's completely appropriate for philosophy to engage in questions of value and of what ought to be done as well as what is the case. Then your question 3 was about naturalism. And so as I was suggesting before, I think it very much depends on how much it's built into naturalism. So your first sort of sub question was about methodological naturalism, and so if methodological naturalism, if that means that that philosophers should be modeling, should be just sort of copying the methodology of the natural sciences, then I reject, in that sense, I reject methodological naturalism, because I think the methodology of the natural sciences is not appropriate for philosophical questions. I don't think it would make sense for there may be some specific philosophical questions where it's helpful, but I don't think in general that we would make more philosophical progress if we started doing experiments, because there are a lot of the issues that we're concerned with don't naturally lend themselves to experimental test, just as it would be wrong to tell mathematicians or historians that they should start copying the method of the natural sciences. I think there's a kind of looser sense of naturalism where it just means something vague, that we should, as it were, be investigating it, in a broadly scientific spirit, that we should be concerned with constraining what we say by what the evidence supports, that we should be working in a sort of systematic manner, that we should be critical and try to be fair to what our opponents are saying. All these kinds of very general things I think are fine, but of course but they don't lead to a very distinctive sort of naturalism. And with metaphysical naturalism. I mean, I take it that means the rejection of supernatural entities. Then I don't think that should be a methodological constraint on all philosophers. I mean, I myself, I'm an atheist, so I don't believe in the existence of God, but I don't think that something like analytic theology should be rejected just on completely straightforward methodological grounds. I mean, I'm not myself sympathetic to it, and I might have all kinds of, and I'm sure I would have all kinds of disagreements with it at the level of specific things that analytic theologians say. But I don't think it should just be rejected out of hand. And for example, if one meant by the metaphysical naturalism that the only things that exist are things recognized by the natural sciences, I don't think that's a constraint, because the natural sciences are not our only ways of investigating reality. And so, for example, if mathematics recognizes the existence of abstract objects such as sets, that's a reason for taking them seriously, and we shouldn't be objecting to that, even if it turns out that the sets that we're talking about are ones which are not involved in physics. So so again, I don't think that you can get really strong constraints from metaphysical naturalism. I mean, I don't accept metaphysical naturalism if that involves some very restrictive kind of view about what's acceptable in ontology. And then on your fourth question, which was the one about progress, well, I think it would not be realistic to say that we're getting a huge amount of consensus or convergence in philosophy, but my experience is, for example, when one goes to other sciences, for example, psychology, sometimes in epistemology, I want to see what the psychologist's view of something is, and I'm always struck by how much disagreement there is amongst psychologists, and yet I think it's fairly clear that psychology is making some kind of progress. And so, as you suggested, I'm most sympathetic to a picture in which the progress that we're making consists in the accumulation of knowledge, which is present, even though there may be people who reject it, even maybe philosophers who reject it. And so, for example, in the case of model building, the kinds of knowledge that I think we're accumulating are, on the one hand, we're accumulating a lot of knowledge about how various models in philosophy work, which is basically, in fact, mathematical knowledge, but it's a kind of, as it were, philosophically relevant mathematical knowledge that you get, and much of the progress in natural sciences with model building may consist of some mathematical exploration of the models, and so that's, as it were, that's kind of quite precise, but it's in a way rather abstract and not directly connected with the phenomena that we're trying to understand. But then we also get an accumulation of knowledge about how well or badly various models relate to the subject matter that we're trying to understand, whatever phenomena in epistemology or even moral and political philosophy those are. And I think that we do, in fact, accumulate a fair bit of such knowledge, even though not everybody accepts it. But as it were, there are, quite a lot of things unknown. Of course, that's progress in the respect to model building, and I'm not suggesting that model building is the only thing that philosophers could be doing. But I think that in other respects as well, there is some progress in the accumulation of knowledge, even though that many of the things that are known are things that are that are challenged by other people. But again, I don't think we should worry too much about that sort of thing, because so many things in the sciences are known are also challenged, by mavericks and so on in the sciences. And so, I think we have to be beware of taking, something that philosophers are, self-critical philosophers are somewhat inclined to do, is to take the most optimistic possible view of progress in the sciences and the most pessimistic possible view of progress in philosophy, and of course that's a completely unfair comparison. So I think when we look, when we make a fairer comparison, we see that actually the kind of progress that's being made in philosophy is not totally unlike the progress that is being made in other sciences. Right. Yeah, so thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Okay, thank Professor Williams. Yes, very nice answers, and Professor Leon's very interesting questions. So, dear audience, you are very welcome to propose your question if you have. Okay. Anyway, maybe we need to wait for a time for people to input a question. Okay. By the way, I have some questions in mind. Okay. The first question is about the dividing line between science and philosophy. You claim that philosophy is a kind of non-natural science. So the first question is that what's the dividing line for you between natural science and non-natural science? And secondly, for you, is any dividing line between philosophy and science? Yeah, this is my first question. The second question is about the truth in philosophy. We know that truth in mathematics can be proved, and the truth in physics can be tested by experiments. People often think that philosophy is not about the truth, but about the justification of truth. Do you think so? If so, what is the methodology of justification of truth in philosophy? The last question is about, yes, this also Professor Liu asked, is related to his question, that it's about the methodology of philosophy. You claim that the methodology from other science, like physics or mathematics, can be applied in philosophy. For example, adoption, inference, and model building. My question is that do you think that you say that you claim that philosophy has its own methodology, but does it have some distinctive methodology? I mean that this distinctive methodology from philosophy can also provide us some powerful and useful tool for the application in other science like physics or mathematics. Yeah, this is my question. Okay, thank you.
Right. So thanks. So the first question well, it was partly about how I draw a dividing line between the natural and non-natural sciences. So by the natural sciences, I mean things like physics, chemistry, biology, and so on. And I'm thinking of them as distinguished by a certain kinds of method. I mean, their use of experiment and observation by instruments and measurement by instruments and so on. And so, I mean, that's not a totally precise dividing line, and in some ways, there are aspects of theoretical physics, for example, which might be closer to philosophy than they are to some aspects of experimental physics. But that's broadly the line, and then so I think that the kind of subjects that I mentioned are natural sciences, whereas on the non-natural side, I would put, for example, the study of history, because although people say, well, it's empirical, which in some sense is true, but the methodology of history, which mainly involves the written sources. I mean, they're not the only sources, but they're absolutely central to the distinctive sort of methodology of history. The use of documents to support claims, I think it gives it a methodology which is so different from the natural sciences that it's really not sensible to call it a natural science. I think mathematics is not a natural science, and philosophy is not a natural science. And so I think that philosophy, I don't draw a distinction between philosophy and science in the sense of, I mean, I do regard philosophy as in its way a kind of science, maybe not the most, in some ways not the most developed, but I think it's the kind of problems which philosophy encounters are also problems which very, very theoretical physics and very, very theoretical biology also encounter. So I think that, it's just that when we get to these highly theoretical questions, that then we're dealing with matters where it is quite hard to resolve these questions. Your second question was about truth in philosophy. So I think the philosophical claims are true or false, like other claims. I mean, it's hard. Of course, it's often hard to know which they are, but that's also true of many claims in physics, for example. I mean, at the moment, a lot of sort of foundational theoretical physics has got rather stuck because the the sort of research program of string theory seems to have run into trouble, and so the situation in theoretical physics is one where progress at the moment in those specific parts of physics seems to be proving very difficult to make. But the questions are still ones which have true or false answers. I mean, of course, in philosophy, we're often dealing with rather vague statements, but then I've defended an epistemicist view of vague statements on which even they are either true or false. It's just, again, difficult to know to know which. And then your third question was about the methodology of philosophy and about whether philosophy has any distinctive methods that you don't find in other subjects. So I think that I doubt that there's any method that's used in philosophy that is never used outside philosophy, because philosophy is it kind of for one thing, it actually overlaps a lot of the sort of theoretical end of many other subjects. Like, I mean, there's a kind of overlap between philosophy of physics and theoretical physics, for example. I mean, I think it's clear that certainly within contemporary analytic philosophy, thought experiments are used more often and maybe more systematically than in any other discipline. But of course, it's not the case that that thought experiments are used only in philosophy, because Galileo and Einstein and others had their own thought experiments. So I think it would be hard to put one's finger on a philosophical a method that was used only in philosophy. But I do think that when you look at philosophy from a methodological point of view, you get a kind of balance of uses of different methods, which is somewhat different from the one that you find in any other subject. But and so I don't. I mean, probably if you look at the natural sciences, I mean, probably there's unless you talk at a very, very local, specific level, there's if you take physics, there's probably no method that is used only at a relatively broad sense of method that's used only in physics.
Okay. For you, that mathematics is not natural science, and philosophy is a kind of non-natural science. So philosophy is, in spirit is close to mathematical, but mathematical start from very precise definition of a concept. But that in philosophy, it's hard for us to give a very precise definition of the concept, and then we declude from the original definition to get a more conclusion. So it seems that there's a huge difference between philosophy of mathematical, even if you regard both of them as non-natural science. On the other hand, maybe for you that theoretical physics is also kind of non-natural science, very close to philosophy. But in theoretical philosophy, maybe we can propose new hypotheses. But it says that if the theorem based on a hypothesis, it can be only accepted as scientific only if the phenomena derived from this hypothesis can be observed or tested through experiments. For example, if you propose a theoretical theory about black hole, maybe you can just use your imagination and you can propose a very beautiful theory about black hole. But it seems that scientists can only accept the truth of this theory to be the scientific discovery only when that the phenomena derived from this hypothesis can be observed or can be tested with experiments. So, but for philosophy, of course, you can propose your hypothesis or just your theoretical system. But it seems that it has to test the validity of this hypothesis.
Yeah. So I just a couple of comments on that. I mean, one has to do with, you know, you're saying, well, in mathematics everything is very, very precise, whereas in philosophy we're dealing with quite vague ideas. I think one can actually overestimate how precise the basic ideas in mathematics are, because, you know, if you take the standard framework for mathematics, which is set theory, so you know, if you look at the language of set theory, the basic, I mean, the most basic term there is the term for the, you know, for being a member of a set. But that's not something which has a mathematical definition. And, you know, the idea of set and a member of a set, those are just understood informally. And then mathematics proceeds by having a whole lot of postulates, I mean, the axioms of set theory, which, I mean, those themselves can be formulated in a very precise way, but the actual, the terms involved in them, like the symbol for membership, those are not themselves defined, and they're actually, you know, they're explained in a quite an informal and rough sort of way. And so as it were, the rigor comes not because as it were, the basic terms are themselves particularly precise, but because we've got these specified axioms about them, which we can work with. And, you know, and so just to give an example of something that's somewhat similar in metaphysics, if you take mereology, the study of parts and wholes, I mean, you know, you can give some axiomatization of mereology, which is just as precise as the axiomatization of set theory, and then you can, and from those axioms, you can deduce things. Of course, you know, people can challenge some of the axioms of set theory, and there can be of mereology, and people can propose new axioms of mereology, but that is also can also happen in set theory. I mean, some people, you know, some mathematicians may reject the axiom of choice, and others may be proposing, you know, new axioms which they hope, for example, will settle the continuum hypothesis. So, you know, once you start thinking of it in that slightly more abductive spirit, the difference between what's happening in mathematics and what's happening in philosophy is not so great. I mean, you know, as I say, with mereology, the basic notion, let's say, is part of, and the notion of part of is just informally understood, but it's informally understood, you know, it's understood about as well as the basic notion in set theory, which is member of. So that's one thing I would say about, you know, the contrast of mathematics is not as great as it might seem. And the other thing you were saying when we're talking about natural sciences, that you know, for them the sort of ultimate test is in experiment. But, you know, so one example which I think is quite, you know, interesting to think about is the use of model building in biology, which is, I mean, some of that is to do with models which can very easily be tested by experiment. But if you look at the kind of more theoretical end of biology, so, you know, the kind of the sort of thing that biologists are interested in is, well, why is the norm in the natural world to have reproduction by two sexes? I mean, why aren't there lots of species which have three sexes, and where they have some system of reproduction that involves three sexes. And then in explaining why not, they, typically what biologists will be doing is building mathematical models of hypothetical species that do have three-sex reproduction, and then they'll be studying, as it were, the kind of thing that can go wrong. If you have a reproduction by three sexes rather than by two, and and I take it that that's the kind of thing that can produce, quite good explanations of why we don't see such and such phenomena in biology, or why they're not widespread. But they're not; those are not things that can be tested directly by experiment or measurement, precisely because what we're explaining is why we don't get a certain phenomenon, and so there's nothing there to be measured. So so I think that's an example of the kind of use of model building in biology, which it's not exactly like philosophy, but it's considerably closer to the kind of thinking that is involved in philosophy. And in particular, it's related. It's also related to what goes on in thought experiments and so on, because it's thinking what would follow if such and such had been the case, in order to explain why it's not the case. So I think that the differences in both those respects, the differences between philosophy and other disciplines are not as great as they might initially seem to be.
Okay, thank you for your very knowledgeable replies. Yeah, there are a lot of new things. Okay. Should I say more or just we close? Yeah. I agree that you will come to the frontier of the mathematics and the philosophy come in. Yes, mathematics come from the axioms and the notion. The axiom may be the primitive, and when they have a different approach to do this. Yeah, but you say that for example, if we can axiomatize some fragment of philosophical questions, for example, some question about epistemology or about notion of knowledge, and then you think that this subject becomes the subject of logic or mathematics. Isn't that philosophy is focused on some? For me, is that focused on some conceptual analysis for some for some primitive notion, for some problem or notion which is harder to axiomatize, or people find it very difficult to axiomatize it. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, in the case of I gave Mariology as an example, which is because Mariology is part of metaphysics. It's the people who do it are people in metaphysics, and in the case of Mariology, an axiomatization is possible. But I completely agree with you that there are many areas where an axiomatic system is not really feasible, and I think that's that's true of a lot of epistemology. That even in formal epistemology, people are not really working with axiomatic systems, but they are working with formal models, and so so there. Once you've defined a formal model, if it's properly defined, then the investigation of its its properties is basically a matter of mathematics. I mean, typically mathematics as done within something like model theory or some and so there the comparison is better with what's going on in some of the natural sciences, whereas but I mentioned the case of Mariology because that's an example of where the level of precision I think is actually as great as in set theory, whereas but of course with the models the actual specification of the model is itself totally precise, but it's just the contrast between the pure axiomatic approach and the model building approach is that in the pure axiomatic approach, the idea is that the axioms are things which are plausibly true, that they're actually true universal generalizations, and that applies to the Mariology as well as to set theory. But with model building, we're not trying to give a general for example, if we're building models of knowledge in such and such situations, we're not trying to lay down general laws of knowledge. We're simply trying to describe what the structure of the knowledge is in a particular type of case, and we're making the case very, very simple and, as one might say, idealized. So there with the and then that's similar to biology, because biology also does not proceed in an axiomatic way. So I agree that the axiomatic approach can't be applied universally in philosophy. I think it's the areas where it can be applied maybe as we're comparatively limited, but I think that the model building approach can be applied much more widely and doesn't require some kind of axiomatic background, but it just uses ordinary mathematics.
Okay, thank you very much for your answers, and also thank you for your wonderful lectures. Also thank Professor Yong for his questions. Also we thank our audience for attending this lecture. Also thanks the staff from CHENG for their work. Okay, it's time to say goodbye, and have a nice week, and we look forward to see you next Saturday at the same time.
Yes, see you next Saturday. Right. Thanks very much for all the questions.
I have something to do.